Hey, what's up, you amazing keyboard cowboys? I hope you're all doing well today. We're going to learn a little bit about Burp Suite settings. Now, Burp Suite has a few types of settings, project settings, user settings. We're going to see what they do for most of them. At least we're not going to touch on sequencer because that can be an entire video on and of itself. And we're not going to go too deep into how Burp Suite works either, but we do need to go over these settings themselves. Now, of course, there's a very handy dandy little help file that you can just click and it will open a new window exactly where you want to be. Let's start with the proxy settings. Proxy settings are project settings. We cannot save our project files in the free version of Burp Suite. That means that there's no way of keeping this if we ever close our Burp Suite in the free version. That is messed up, I know, but we'll have to live with it. Here you can add multiple proxies on multiple interfaces. Why would that be useful, you might be wondering to yourself. Well, let's say that you're testing mobile, for example, and you have an Android and an iOS application. You might want to have them come in through different proxies because then you can later on filter through your traffic coming from each port individually. That's going to really help a lot, of course. Now, you need to insert Burp Suite CA certificate, of course. You can import/export that CA certificate through this option, and you can regenerate your CA certificate if you ever required to do so. Each proxy as well, we can edit here. We can see bind to port. This is, of course, the port that we want to set it on, and we can set it on a specific interface. Very useful if you have physical interfaces as well. Request handling is going to either redirect the requests received by a listener to a host or port or not, or enforce the use of TLS. And we also have the invisible proxying. Now, this is really useful because it might be less easy to detect that we're using a proxy if we enable this. That's going to be useful because we don't always want to have our client know that we're using a proxy. Sometimes we want to be very covert, then we have that invisible proxying option. Here we have some more certificate options, and for the TLS protocol, we can use the protocols of our Java installation, or we can use custom protocols there. We can also enable support over HTTP 2, and that is for every single proxy separately, all of those settings. Then you can also have your request interception rules. Here you can already see that we're not intercepting, so here, intercept based on these requests. File extension does not match GIF, JPEG. I know I will not call it GIF. PNG, CSS, JS, ICO. Those are not going to get intercepted through the request. That is, of course. Now we can also, for example, say if the HTTP method does not match get post, if the URL is in target scope, we can add interception rules here in which they may or may not get intercepted. For example, if we only want specific things to be intercepted, we can enable this here. If we want specific requests not to be intercepted at all, we can also enable that here, and it is based on a Boolean operator. The match type of what you want to match on specifically, like the protocol, the request that's being made, the cookie names, the body, and then matches or does not match, and then the condition that's going to be like here. We can also do the same for response rules. If the response does not match 3 or 4, for example, then we can drop that request. The content type header must match text. These are all interception rules that we can set up to make our traffic that more honed. The WebSocket interception rules, you can leave those on by default. That's just if you need to intercept WebSocket messages. But the response modification rules are very handy, dandy little rules though. Here you can unhide hidden form fields. If you have a hidden form field, now it's not going to be hidden anymore in your response, that is. You can also highlight that field because, of course, I want to know exactly what it is. And if you enable this option, a big red square will be drawn around your hidden fields. You can also enable disabled form fields. You can remove input field length limits, and you can remove JavaScript form validation. This is client-side protection, meant to protect user from their own stupidity. Like this is not API security, let's put it that way. But of course I don't want to remove all JavaScript because that might stop my site from working altogether. And this is also, while I'm just clicking through, these are the proxy rules, by the way, just so you're aware. Removing object tags, converting HTTPS links to HTTP, removing secure flags from cookies. I just leave those on usually because otherwise I might get a false positive myself. We also have match and replace rules. Here we have specific request headers that we might want to replace. Those are going to be useful if we want to emulate, for example, a specific, let's say we want to replace our user agent with, for example, iOS, Android, Internet Explorer, and we can enable certain rules here for match and replace. TLS pass-through if we want to have certain hosts or ranges where TLS is just going to get ignored, but of course those pass-throughs do mean that you don't get to intercept your traffic with Burp Suite because it's passing through, of course. When it comes to proxy logging for the history, it doesn't log out of scope items by default. You can ask it every time what it has to do, or it can do nothing. But in this case, I could just leave this default usually, and then the default proxy interception state, I also usually leave this to disable intercept. Now, what does this do? When you start the Burp Suite, is your intercept on or off? These days it's off, but that's been by popular request. Like before, it used to be on by default, but now we have that option: enable intercept by default, disable, or restore the settings from proxy intercept tab when Burp closed. These are user settings, by the way. These are no longer project settings. So proxy history logging and default proxy interception state are user settings. And then we come back to project settings. You can use HTTP 1, any requests or responses. You can set the response header to connection close. You can set connection header. These are all like, these are miscellaneous, like the name says. I usually don't mess about with these too much because you're not gonna find too many hidden gems in here. When it comes to Intruder, we all know what that does. We tell it where to place its payload. And we have default behavior of replacing that entire base value that we have set up. We can also tell it to append to a base parameter value. So it's going to add it to the end of your parameter, and it's not just going to replace it fully. Can be useful in certain situations if you need to enable it. Now you know. New tab configuration, what happens when a new tab is opened? Does it use the default attack configuration? Is it going to copy the configuration from the first tab that it's opened or from the last one? These are all user settings. And then we have another user setting, what the behavior is going to be when we are closing a window, and it's going to, in this case, ask us each time to do with the attack in progress, and it can either continue on the background or delete the attack entirely. And we also have when closing finished attacks. So if an attack has gone through with Intruder, you used to have, like, we weren't really able to save those, but now we are, thankfully, though not to the project file in the free version. We can keep them in memory, we can delete the attacks when we close them, or we can ask to do every time. If you don't want this, if you know what happens when you close that Intruder window, by the way, right? It asks you what do you want to do with the results, and you can, here in these settings, you can enable default behavior there, so you don't have to click it every single time. Burp Suite Pro can also have your own payloads. We know that. So in your Intruder, you can have your own lists of payloads. Where do you find those lists of payloads? That's what this bottom setting is going to do if you have the Pro version. Onto the repeater. Here we can use our connection. We use HTTP 1 or 2, and we can allow HTTP to ALPN override. These are very specific settings. You might never need them in your life, but if you need them, then you know that they are here. Message modification. We can update the content length. So in the repeater, if you make a change, you can either choose to update the content length to reflect your update. Like if there were 2 characters, content length was 2, and you change it to 5 characters, then it might automatically update it to 5. That is that section. Unpack, gzip, or deflate speaks for itself, and we can also normalize HTTP1 line endings and strip connection headers over HTTP2. Again, very specific settings, but if you ever need them, now you know where to find them. What happens when your repeater, because again, we are in the repeater, remember that, what happens when it comes onto a redirect? So we send a request, we receive a redirect, what do? Do we follow it? Yes or no? You will know that we have that button up top, follow redirect or not. We can also do that automatically for on-site only or in scope only. That means things that are on the same website or in scope that we have set up, or we can always follow redirects. We can process cookies in those redirects as well, or we can use the selected protocol for cross-domain redirects. Then we have the default tab group. These settings are for your groups with your in regards to your tabs. It's for this case when a new request gets made, what tab group is it added to? That's basically what this is going to do. Now in your tab view, we all know that if you have like 50 tabs open, sometimes it can scroll all the way to the right. These days it wraps around, so it opens tab here, and then when you open a new tab, it opens a little bit lower and you get rows of tabs. That is what this is, that tab view. Sequencer, again, we're going to make a separate video on, and Burp Suite's browser. Here is where you can store the browser data. You all know that when Burp first launched its browser, I keep saying you all know that, but of course, I'm sorry, I shouldn't assume that. When Burp Suite first launched its built-in browser, it didn't remember your logins and passwords that he used in that browser, and it could be annoying to have to enter them every single time. I know it shouldn't be, you shouldn't store them, but that's kind of thing. Now we store the browser data files in here, this specific folder. We can also clear all of the things that we have saved there. So if we ever need that, here is the button. When the browser is running, we can choose to use the GPU or not, and we can use Burp Suite's browser without a sandbox. This might be a little bit unwise if you're scanning a target that you're not 100% sure of. You're running out of a sandbox. What that sandbox basically is that if ever the browser does get compromised, it runs in a sandbox. It cannot escape to your local computer. Now let's go over to project real fast, because here we have our scope, the usual scope settings that we know, where we select a protocol, a host, a specific port, and a file if we want to. That includes our scope, of course, and we can exclude items from scope as well. Now, what happens with things that are out of scope? What do we do with them? Do we drop all of the requests or not? That is what that last setting does. When it comes to the Collaborator, here, if you do have a Burp Suite Collaborator version, or if you have the Pro version, I should say, you can set up your Burp Suite's private Collaborator server somewhere. You can use the Burp Collaborator, or you can choose to not use the Burp Collaborator. It can also be over encrypted HTTP if that is a requirement. Now onto tasks, because in tasks here, when a task is running, we have resource pools. It is a amount of tasks that can run at the same time, with the amount of concurrent requests and request delay and random delay and delay increment and auto backoff. So we can set all of these things up, and these resource pools are used for certain tools. If you start your tasks, if you have a new task, does it start automatically or does it pause? So this is a setting to control whether it starts when they are tasks when they are created. Do they automatically start, or are they started in paused mode? If you start a Burp Suite, do your tasks then start up automatically or not? That's the setting below that, the automated task on startup. And the scheduled tasks, we can run Burp Suite on a schedule in the Pro version as well. Automatic backups, if you have the Pro version, you have the option to save your project files. Here we can set up those automatic backups. When it comes to logging, here we can set up more specific things to logging. Use these settings to control logging of HTTP requests and response to log files. So here we can set up certain log files if we want to. Very, very useful if you're pen testing, by the way. Very useful because you can give this to your customer if need be. You can save this for internal logging. You can just save it to a file, put it on a server somewhere secure, and it's really going to help. For some people, that is, of course. When it comes to sessions, here we can set up how Burp Suite is supposed to handle session. That can be from the cookies from Burp Suite's cookie jar, but here we can also add more session handling rules where you have certain actions. For example, check session is valid, run a macro, and for a Burp Suite extension, set a specific header if we want to log in with somebody for a specific session. It's all a possibility that we can set up here. And in the cookie jar, here in our normal proxy, we can see all of those cookies are being saved, but not automatically in the scanner, repeater, intruder, sequencer, or the extensions. If you want to have that enabled, if you want to give that access, for example, the scanner, if you want to give it access to your cookie jar, here you have to enable that. A macro is, of course, a sequence of one or more requests. We can add a macro here. Here we can record a macro if we want to. We can enable or disable intercept. We don't have any requests right now, so we cannot select any requests, but in this macro recorder we can execute those. What can that be used for? For example, for logging in. Then we have the network section. Here we can have our connections. We can set up certain stuff about connections if we want to. We're not going to go too deep into this because, frankly, this isn't something most people are ever going to use. But let's say that you're running Burp Suite, which is a proxy, and you're behind another proxy. Then you might have to set up an upstream proxy server, and that's here. If you're working with a SOX proxy, that's also a possibility. Those settings are here, which I wanted to highlight. When it comes to TLS, here we also have some TLS specific options like server TLS, the client TLS certificate, and the Java TLS settings, but again, hardly ever going to be adapted. Mostly the other things that we've talked about before are going to be useful. Though here, same thing, user interface is a different thing. If you have, for example, you want to enable a bigger font, that's possible here. We can set our font to 20. That's going to be a lot bigger, of course. And then a suite settings as well for the REST API, because the Burp Suite Pro does come with a REST API. Of course, we can have the auto updater enabled or not, and we can use the early adopter channel if we want to have a chance of testing features early sometimes. Then we also have a performance feedback section. Here we can choose to anonymously submit feedback, and we can log exceptions to a local directory as well if we have something that we want to log, and we have our debug ID in here as well. Most people are never going to be in touch with this, but if you ever need your debug ID, or if you need to log all exceptions to a local directory, here's where you're going to find it. You can also find the, for example, right now we're using the default system temp directory for the temporary files location. If we ever have a temporary file that needs to be stored somewhere, we can also use a custom location, and we also have the extension options, which most people are going to be using their Jython standalone jar. So if you ever have an extension that uses your Jython, this is where you can set that. Same for Ruby, your JRuby jar file, and your Java environment if you want to set that up as well. For startup behavior, you can choose if you want to automatically update your installed POPs or if you want to automatically reload your extensions on startup. So that's quite an extensive options list already, but we also have global settings here. We can restore and save these settings if we want to, which might be very useful because especially in the Burp Suite Pro version, you cannot save your project itself. This way you can still save some options and restore them. So I hope that was useful for you, my friends. If you have any specific questions about Burp Suite, I would love to hear about it. And we'll make a new video series and course about the new updates soon as well, because not only has the UI changed, but also the core functionality, especially of the Pro version, has also gained a few new feathers. Thank you very much for watching, my friends. I really appreciate your time, and I will see you in the next one.